Yes, we can, I think. Orithro, can we go?
Yes, ma'am, we are live.
So, good evening, everybody. We have reached the final day of the webinar, and I welcome you all once again to the third and final day of the 3-day international webinar on Theorising Caste, Castes of Theory, organized by the Department of Sociology in collaboration with the IQAC. In the very beginning, I would like to request all to keep their microphones muted when not speaking to ensure a smooth functioning of the virtual platform. Now, I would like to request Professor Ritu Sen Chaudhuri, Professor, Department of Sociology, West Bengal State University, to please give the welcome address. Ritu, please.
Yes, am I audible?
Yes, you are, Ritu.
Yeah, okay. So, this webinar is an occasion of being with others while we are theorizing castes of theory. We tend to negotiate with the prevalent academic trends of forgetting theory so as to remain receptive to the phenomenal, especially when it comes to the question of caste. We do this confronting the high Western theories, which on the other hand sometimes overwhelm the real and the ethical. For many of us, theorizing caste is a constant act of tracing its real discursive presence in terms of straight indictments of discrimination, as well as in terms of latent subconscious practices. Caste is manifested in multiple and complex forms. Along with its structural engagements with caste, we think of its phenomenological dimensions too. We think of how the life worlds of the non-dominant are systematically effaced from the realm of authentic knowledge, from the realm of dominant theory, and thus we subvert the castes of theory. Now, as Titir has already said, that this is a welcome address, and I do welcome all of you in the final session of this 3-day event. I especially Anupama Rao, who in spite of certain serious familial concerns is now here with us. This is because she is already one amongst us, sharing similar dreams and contentions. I would very quickly abstract a few points which have been coming up, as many of us have been speaking here since the last 2 days. As Professor Guru and Sarukai were talking about their 2019 volume Experience, Caste and the Everyday Social, seeking for an ethical outside, attempting to move beyond the disembodied reasoned epistemology, reconceptualizing the realm of everyday social in terms of sensorial experiences. They think of the everyday social as it is drawn in a preconceptual feeling of belongingness or being with, something which is prior to rational knowing. Guru and Sarukai come to talk about experience as an intervening moment transcending the duality of structure and individual. Experience is mediated by the basic senses of touch, smell, and taste before being constituted in terms of structure, and marks it fundamentally as the place where ethical relations can germinate through the notion of moitri, which signifies the ethical relationship between the multiple socials. Now, responding to their views, the House had raised the feminist debates on experience, which holds which holds that experiential mediations are always also ideological and are not preconceptual or prediscursive. The four papers presented yesterday by Hardik, Shomrat, Kollan, and Shubhro took their turn to think of the limitations of the disembodied reasoned epistemology, critiquing the rational democratic discourses while they read the representations of tribal woman, which render her as a portable device of state propaganda. They read the uncanny and haunted in Dalit narratives, reflecting moments and worlds which remain unstated in dominant linguistic modes and devices. They raise the questions of extremely complex nature of Dalit identity in terms of their negotiations with the right-wing ideologies, and speak of the spectral presence of caste in the nationalist discourses of the 19th and 20th centuries. Along with Srirupa Prasad, we have pushed the conversation to haunt the sheer grounds of experience of the men and women in multiple worlds. As a result, a host of questions came onto the board. The questions concerning why theory, whose theory, who speaks on behalf of whom, or who has the stable speaking position, and how do we destabilize this while we raise the questions of the marginal, the Dalit, the woman, and while we raise the question of caste. How do we challenge the conceptual analytical categories of the social science disciplines speaking together with humanities and arts? Now, we do not have any ready answers to these queries, as we all do find ourselves grappling with them. I would just want to make a few observations here and underscore that the point of critiquing the dominant modes of knowing, which assumes the knower-known divide, is not to scale down the importance of democratic responses to caste. Sharing the anxieties of the everyday experiences of caste. I deliberately call it anxiety, as I do not think I have the moral authority to call it humiliation or oppression, as at this moment I'm not directly engaging with that. So sharing the experiences of the everyday experiences, sharing the anxieties of the everyday experiences of caste, we just want to make a very, very simple point. If we talk about caste only in terms of factual events and phenomena, that is, in mere empirical terms, if we talk about caste in mere empirical terms, we would not be able to reach at its core, at its discursive ideational foundations which pervades our beings and knowings. This will reduce the import of studying caste to a contextual perspective, attending to its predicaments on an ad hoc basis. To explicate this, I take recourse to Ambedkar, where he says that our language and culture remain mired in the system of caste. Caste is a state of mind. The destruction of caste does not mean the destruction of a physical barrier. It means a notional change. How can a notional change be brought without abstract conceptual thinking, without what he calls a trained imagination? Thanks, Shubhro, for raising this point of trained imagination. I consider this very, very significant, and I've also written about it elsewhere. So, violating the canons of historical research, Ambedkar gives himself the task of retrieving the history of untouchability without adequate evidential data through trained imagination. Now, intricately following the Hindu Shastras and Smritis, Ambedkar often lands up to paradoxes and broken threads. He constructs the missing links of history of caste lying buried in a dead past through imagination, intuition, and the ability to make things up in one's own mind. So, beyond the disembodied reasoned epistemology, here lies the significance of utopia. Without the sense of utopia, how can one move towards something that is not there? Ambedkar's over, in spite of the fact that it is closely associated to the liberal Western discourses of democracy, progress, and justice, cannot be circumscribed within that. Let us remember that Ambedkar is thinking something that has never been thought before: the annihilation of caste. So, with these few words, I again welcome Anupama Rao and Anirban Dash. Through her ingenious theorizations, Anupama has always remained a source of intellectual support for me, helping me understand the structural complicity of caste and gender. I love reading her text, reflecting her astute feminist understanding. Coming to Anirban, he remains closely associated to all my intellectual efforts as well as conceiving and organizing this webinar. Together, we have theorized a position of third world feminism. Now it is up to Anupama and Anirban. But before that, I'll request Titi to formally introduce these two speakers to the house and to the viewers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritu for giving a very short but detailed analysis of the purpose and implications of the 3-day event that we have organized. Our speaker for today do not await any introduction. Still, I would like to give a short introduction for our students and for the young scholars. Anupama Rao is the Associate Professor, Department of History, Barnard College, Columbia University. She is the Senior Editor of Comparative Studies in South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and Acting Director, Institute for Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia University. Dr. Rao has research and teaching interests in gender and sexuality studies, caste and race, historical anthropology, social theory, comparative urbanism, and colonial genealogies of human rights and humanitarianism. She has written widely on the themes of colonialism and humanitarianism and on non-Western histories of gender and sexuality. Her book, The Caste Question, published in 2009, theorized caste subalternity with specific focus on the role of anti-caste thought in producing alternative genealogies of political subject formation. She is currently working on a book on the political thought of B.R. Ambedkar and a project titled Dalit Bombay, which explores the relationship between caste, political culture, and everyday life in colonial and post-colonial Bombay. Her recent publications include the edited volume Gender, Caste, and the Imagination of Equality, published in 2017, and The Many Worlds of R.B. Moore, Memoir of Dalit Communist, published in 2019, among many more. The discussant for this session will be Dr. Anirban Dash, Associate Professor, Department of Cultural Studies, Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. He has been a member of the editorial collective From the Margins, a journal of critical theory in a post-colonial setting. His research interests include feminist theory, science studies, the literary and the vernacular, post-colonial theory, body studies, and theory in the broad sense. With a background of applied natural sciences and a subsequent training in history, followed by philosophy, he tries to combine empirical research with philosophical analysis. He has published several articles on science in the colony, post-colonial theory, and feminist theory in renowned journals in both English and Bangla. His publications include the edited volume Banglaয় Binirman or Binirman, published in 2007, Towards the Politics of the Impossible, The Body in Third World Feminisms, published in 2010, among many others. Now I would like to request Dr. Anirban Dash to please begin the session. Dr. Das, it's over to you.
Hello. Am I being heard? Do you hear me? No?
You're audible.
So welcome everyone, and definitely, specifically Professor Anupama Rao, whom we have been reading for long. But like just seeing for the first time, and welcome everyone, and I will not really waste time now. We go straight on to the talk. So, Professor Anupama Rao, I request you to begin.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. So I'm actually going to read, but I wanted to begin with a few comments. One, I think, is the way that, and thank you, Ritu, for the invite, and I'm really very, very pleased to be part of this conversation. I wanted to sort of start with something that Ritu began with, which is the question of what we may call a kind of de-abstraction, right? So if caste itself has been thought systemically or in terms of structure, part of the project of a kind of political ethics, and certainly the question of thinking experience and the everyday social and so forth seems to involve a project of de-abstraction, right? That is to really think the concept down to the ground as a way to actually rethink in many ways the worlds of caste. So I do want to sort of, note that, and then also think a little bit about the terms, given that this is a seminar for Department of Sociology. I thought it might be interesting to think about the question of the social, sociality and sociability, the kinds of terms that sociology as a discipline assumes have a kind of a unity or exist, and certainly the question of the social. So I want to actually go back and think a little bit about the ways in which the social itself, which the discipline of sociology is predicated on, emerges in a sense in the late 19th century as a distinctive domain of life. We could think about the social contract theories and the ways in which they think about the social as a space of kind of consensual relations, if you will. So the question of entering into contract as a voluntary act in some sense, as a mode of self-regulation. In certain liberal theories, we could think about Republican ideologies that really think less from the position of the individual, but more from the perspective of social equality. Or think from the question of the public sphere and think down in some sense to the ways in which the social is organized. We might think with Marx, certainly, who thinks about the social as a domain of inequality, or someone like Arendt, who bemoans, I suppose one could say, the suffusion of the political by the social in the modern period, so that Arendt's effort is in many ways to kind of rescue the domain of the political from the social. But in any case, the social itself is a kind of distinctive domain of life, and the ways in which sociology, the discipline, actually is predicated, is actually organized around an assumption of the social as actually existing. And then the question of caste or the question of race, which I'll also speak about, right? What do we do with forms of embodied difference? What do we do with forms of historical inequality? And forms that actually can't be, in some sense, addressed or redressed in the ways in which the social comes to be thought as a kind of space of modern exploration, engagement, interaction, and indeed of disciplinary formation. So it seems to me that this question of sort of the social and sociology is something that I would like to think a little bit about today. I will do this actually by going back to the young Ambedkar. And what I want to do today in my talk, which is titled Sex and the Social, or we could even say Sex Surplus and the Social, is finally to go back and speak a little bit about castes in India. And do a kind of close reading, if you will, of that first text that Ambedkar produces when he's 25 years old, sitting here at Columbia University, where I'm speaking from today. But in order to do this, I'd like to set up the problem, as it were, in this manner. I want to think a little bit about the question of historical comparison, the ways in which questions of race and caste in the late 19th into the 20th and certainly the 21st centuries, the forms of affinity, the question of comparison, of connectivity between race and caste, has always been a kind of enduring problem or a problematic, and one that has been addressed in quite different ways. But if we think about the supplementarity of race and caste, and the ways in which each problematize, I suppose you could say, the emergence of sociology as a discipline, and then sort of in a sense move back and think about the specificity of caste, given the ways in which it is associated or comes to be seen as something that is proximate to race, it might allow us to think a little bit about the formation of sociology, both as a discipline, but also the place of caste in sociological thinking. And in some sense, to go back to a kind of disciplinary history, but also an institutional history, if you will, which will sort of bring me back to the United States, to the formation of disciplines, and also to interactions and engagements between Du Bois and Ambedkar. So that's sort of the broad arc of what I want to do. And I'll do that by actually beginning with a recent text that has caste back on the radar, in fact, has ended up sort of globalizing caste in a way that many of us who've been working and thinking about caste haven't really quite been able to do. And this is the recently published text, Caste, The Origin of Our Discontent by Isabel Wilkerson. So what I actually want to do is to pick up on the Wilkerson text and speak a little bit about that text, and use that as a way to go back and think about what is being argued for caste through this kind of comparative lens, and what she wants to suggest is happening with sort of race and caste. I'll use this as a kind of point of entry, as I said, to doing a broader kind of disciplinary and institutional history about race and caste thinking in the late 19th and the 20th centuries. And end finally with castes in India and a kind of theorization, an effort to theorize caste, where I think this question of the relationship between experience, embodiment, and then the question of abstraction becomes quite profound and is profoundly illuminated by the young Ambedkar, and he produces a text that he keeps returning to again and again. So Castes in India is a text, bits of which return in the 45, what Congress and Gandhi have done to the untouchables. Castes in India becomes a kind of early formulation for the unpublished Revolution, Counter-Revolution in ancient India. And so it becomes a text that Ambedkar himself returns to with some sort of regularity, with a kind of repetitive regularity. And so indeed, it's worth thinking a little bit about the ways in which caste is set up as a system in that text, the instability of caste as system that Ambedkar already alludes to in that text, and indeed the relationship between the question of sexuality, the sexuate, if you will, as something that actually has the ability to consistently destabilize the formation of the social. So this is sort of where I want to go with my talk. But please bear with me. I'm going to read, and I think what I've been suggesting will become a little bit more clear as I go through the talk. So in the recently published Caste, The Origin of Our Discontent, Isabel Wilkerson makes a strong case for adopting a term associated with traditional society and heritable hierarchy to describe American racism. Caste is, of course, as we know, typically viewed as intensely local and essentially Indian. Wilkerson suggests instead the opposite. She argues that what we call race in the United States is actually a caste system. Caste, she argues, is the infrastructure of our divisions. And she goes on to write that it is the architecture of human hierarchy that embeds into our bones an unconscious ranking of human characteristics that sets forth the rules, expectations, and stereotypes that have been used to justify brutalities against entire groups within our species. Her effort to rename race as caste is to render systemic racism unfamiliar and thus newly available for inquiry in the US context. Its novelty can disarm critics and catch those who are unself-conscious about their prejudice off guard. Now, Wilkerson is clear that caste and race are neither synonymous nor mutually exclusive. The forms of inequality signaled by their terms are neither identical nor, of course, symmetrical. But why then does Wilkerson choose to use this lexicon, drawn from a social order that she believes has both predated and outlasted state-sponsored racism, right? Caste, in a sense, as a kind of archaic. Since her intervention has less to do with Indian caste in this book than with the changing conditions of American racism, and kind of the opposite move to the kinds of conversations that have been happening about thinking through the Black Lives Matter movement as a way to think about Dalit rights and so on and so forth in the Indian context. So given that her intervention has less to do with Indian caste than with the changing conditions of American racism, one wonders why Wilkerson has not politicized race at the cost of essentializing caste. Right. So this is a text that I find deeply problematic, but at the same time, I think it's worth opening up some of the interesting suggestions and the connections that the text is trying to open up. Right. Hierarchy, the term that Wilkerson uses, is of course a much contested term. In Homo Hierarchicus, an intensely debated field-defining book, as we know, Dumont demarcated an unbridgeable divide between the principle of hierarchy, derived from Hindu religion and the order of encompassment, and distinguished hierarchy from equality between caste status and modern individualism. The argument there was that hierarchy was radically opposed to modern notions of power, equality, and sovereignty, and Dumont went to great lengths to show why hierarchy was not a form of racism. And this will be quite important because in many ways, Ambedkar, predates and in many ways kind of offers us a much more complex understanding of caste, which is neither about encompassment nor individuation, but about a kind of vociferousness and instability in the very order of caste, for which the arguments about sexuality, gender, and indeed the question of endogamy becomes absolutely crucial. So Dumont's understanding is really predicated on a long Orientalist tradition of thinking about a kind of textual and prescriptive order of caste. And of course, the criticisms of Dumont have come from challenging his assumptions of an ancient, a set of textualization of caste organized around ancient Hindu texts. The arguments about the British codification of caste as both a social identity and a political mechanism of control. And then, of course, the fact of today's politics, which is organized around claims to backwardness and the logic of competitive victimization. So even though Wilkerson's text wants to assume a kind of correspondence between the status of blacks in the United States and Dalits, and in fact this is pretty much what the text picks up on in quite troubling ways, what we don't have is, in some sense, the complex systemic understanding of caste and how caste operates. But of course, Wilkerson is less interested in this kind of broader, deeper history. The ways in which we've got British codification of caste, as I said, the ways in which a contemporary caste politics of democratization is actually predicated on claims about backwardness and the logic of competitive victimization, but increasingly as well the ways in which Hindu nationalism has consolidated both upper castes and lower castes around a shared hate object, which is Muslims. But Wilkerson is less interested in the history of the concept than in the power of analogy. Her interest is in the social reproduction of hierarchy and systemic inequality, and less in the efforts to change it or indeed to historicize it. This appears to justify the compression of divergent histories and incommensurable timelines, so American racism, Indian caste. We might recall Hannah Arendt's caution that social revolution, that is, attempts to eliminate inequality, has a record of failure that revolutionary idealism should learn from. And indeed, what Wilkerson is much more interested in pointing thus to is the ways in which ancient caste, archaic caste, allows us to understand modern racism. And so she goes back and erects or speaks to the several pillars of racial caste, which she draws on from her understanding of Indian caste. The taboo against miscegenation, laws of purity and pollution, the idea of inherited rank, the use of terror and violence to police social boundaries, and what she terms Old Testament law, which is similar to Hindu ancient texts, sanctioning racial superiority. Now, while Wilkerson herself focuses on the so-called systemic similarities of race with ancient caste, it's the psychic life of caste, deformed social encounters, refusal to recognize Black achievement, the humiliation of racial disregard, sheer indifference, and especially silence, that is of greatest concern to caste's author. And in fact, this is partly where perhaps we can think through the question of what is happening with caste today, this question of caste and the everyday social that seems to have come up in your conversations over the last few days, to think about whether we actually have an archive, as it were, of these everyday encounters of caste and caste distinction. The sociologist Erving Goffman, and I'm thinking about the racial world, as it were, and American racism, where those kinds of conversations about the psychic life of caste, about the everyday life of, the psychic life of race, and the everyday life of race is much, much more elaborated, might be something for us to turn to as a way of thinking through why it has become so difficult for us, or why it has been so difficult for us in the Indian context to work with a kind of similar set of paradigms for understanding the everyday and changing life worlds of caste. The sociologist Erving Goffman analyzed the dramaturgy of micro-encounters in his study of stigma, what he referred to as spoiled identity. Goffman was interested in the management of perception, the control of reputational risk, as those arose in the context of individual interactions. And it is this kind of a reading of kind of transaction and interaction, everyday interaction and transaction, a kind of social psychology of group behavior, if you will, that Wilkerson and others take recourse to. Terms such as implicit bias, stereotype threat, narcissism, to describe American racism as collective illness. The reason that I'm mentioning all this will become clear. I will come back and think about the laws of imitation, Gabriel Tard, and the ways in which Ambedkar draws on what I think are the early history of some of this kind of work that really gets fleshed out in the US context, and something that the Indian social sciences lose track of in their enormous fixation on thinking about caste systemically, and in thinking through caste as a kind of structure, and really thinking about caste as absolute difference, right, and as completely different from the worlds of and the conversations about equality, about racism, about social difference, and so on and so forth that are happening in the context of the North Atlantic. So just to draw attention to the fact that there is an entire world, a kind of canon, a reading list, if you will, that we might want to go back and draw on. So if we think about Tard and then think about somebody like Goffman and the ways in which that kind of social psychology, the psychic life of caste, something that Ambedkar begins to talk about, he will reference in brief in various parts of his oeuvre, but doesn't really fully take on. It might be interesting to think about what the value of that kind of work may be if we were to actually develop it. So this is, of course, the kind of domain that Wilkerson and her text really draws on. But the material effects of caste and race, American race and American racism, are less directly discussed in this text. There is mention of the working classes, of class formation twice in Wilkerson's book, and each time it is with reference to the white working classes. First, in the context of a discussion of W.E.B. Du Bois's powerful formulation of whiteness as a psychological rage, and next in referencing the psychologist Erich Fromm, whose experience with historical fascism led him to believe that the working classes and poor whites were most likely to identify with virulent racism, perhaps as a consequence of their forced intimacy with Black workers. So this text cast is less interested in focusing on the conflict between labor and capital than on how white supremacy cuts across class position. There's a studious distance that Wilkerson maintains from the Black critical tradition, one which is structured by the problem of slavery as a historical and a philosophical problem, indeed by the problem of freedom, as well as from discussions of race, class, poverty. Instead, and the reason that I picked up on this book is a way to scroll back to thinking through an institutional and intellectual history of conversations about race and caste, is because Wilkerson draws on what came to be called the caste school of social stratification, and in particular the work of the sociologist Alison Davis, who co-authored a book called Deep South, a social anthropological study of caste and class in 1941. Now, this is the text that the Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal drew upon in his world-famous study of racial caste, sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation, the text American Dilemma, the Negro Problem, and Modern Democracy. The U.S. Civil Rights Commission and their 1947 report to secure these rights drew on Myrdal's book, while this 47 report was cited by Justice Earl Warren in his 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, the profoundly significant decision about desegregation and desegregation of education. Now, scholars associated with this school of thought, the caste school of social stratification, compared class in the industrial North with caste in the American South. And again, it is this question about the modern and the archaic, the modern and ancient social forms, etc., that they're constantly drawing upon. So caste, in a sense, is constantly being used as a form of comparison to understand the production of social inequality in the U.S. context. And the main focus of this caste school of social stratification was on the taboo against sexual mixing and the lack of Black social mobility in the context of broader American industrialization, in the aftermath, of course, of the Civil War, and in the context of the Jim Crow regulations. The school focused on ossified Black-white social relations as a barrier to social mobility and the accumulation of wealth. This is why Indian caste, which came to be equated with endogamy and with inherited rank and privilege, was so powerful a comparison for this caste school of social stratification, as it is for someone like Wilkerson, who draws on this entire rich intellectual history as if nothing had changed between the 40s and today, in drawing upon all of those arguments that were being made at the time about the linkages between caste and race. Now, the caste school itself suffered its demise in light of the powerful criticism levied by Oliver Cromwell Cox, a Trinidad-born, University of Chicago-educated sociologist. And it's interesting because Robert Park, who was a central figure in the then emergent field of sociology at the University of Chicago, had used caste as a prism to understand race relations in the United States. So what I'm really trying to open up is the ways in which caste is being used in very, very powerful ways by sociology, by the very formation, in a sense, of sociology as a discipline, especially in the United States. Cox accused the caste school in Caste, Class, and Grace, written in 1948, of merely flipping the white supremacist focus on sexual intimacy, viewing it in positive rather than negative terms, and drawing attention, as I said, to this question of sexual miscegenation and the question of endogamy, right, race endogamy, as one of the founding pillars for understanding the perdurance of American racism. Now, Cox himself drew on the Black Marxist tradition to focus on economic exploitation and political class to explain racial caste. Cox's systemic focus on inequality would carry forward into the work of Eric Williams and Cedric Robinson on racial capitalism. But there were other key texts in the history of capitalism in the Americas, such as the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, Black Reconstruction, written a year before Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste in 1935, and C.L.R. James's Black Jacobin in 1938, that began by prioritizing the world-making potential of slave insurrection, and which really thought systemically, one might say, about slavery as a kind of structure, much in the way that Ambedkar in this period will also be thinking about Brahmanism as a kind of structural structure. But perhaps the most creative transformation of the term caste was by Du Bois, who associated what he called color caste with the birth of modern racism, governed by law and racial capital. And the reason that I'm really thinking through these conjoined histories of race and caste, the histories of sociology, one might say, especially American sociology, but the ways in which sociology is thinking through, the question of the social, but also this particular question of social inequality, race and caste, is also because we could think about Du Bois and Ambedkar as insurgent sociologists, both of whom are engaging the sociological tradition. They're working with the categories and the terms that are given to them with the inception of sociology as a discipline. And each of them transforms the kind of sociological understanding of race and caste in really profound ways, even as they are in a kind of limited conversation, one might say, with each other through this broader intellectual history of race and caste. And again, what I'm trying to do is to also suggest the import, the kind of epochal import, one might say, the transformative import of the term caste for race. We usually tend to think about the ways in which, we could think about race and categories of race and race inequality and so forth as a way to better understand caste. But I want to actually suggest that the opposite was very, very much in place, and that this is part of a kind of intellectual history that is worth going back and recovering. It will become important, of course, also because Ambedkar is being formed into the discipline. He's coming into sociology and a kind of insurgent understanding of sociology, very much through the American sociological tradition, and sitting in the same city, New York, that both he and Du Bois are occupying near simultaneously for a while in the teens, and into the interwar period, slightly. But as I said, because both of them are taking on the sociological craft in very distinctive ways at this time. So to return to Du Bois, who associates color caste with the birth of modern racism, the argument there is that color caste is governed by both law and racial capital. And in fact, Du Bois would congratulate himself for having revolutionized the use of the word caste between 1910 and 1930. William Edward Burger Du Bois noted that a revolution had occurred in the Negro's understanding of caste in the years between 1910 and 1930, and he took responsibility for it. Du Bois had earlier taken recourse to the term social caste in The Souls of Black Folk, written in 1903, but by the time he had written The Evolution of the Race Problem in 1909, Du Bois was using the term color caste to describe a form of entrenched racism that persisted across slavery and freedom, and he noted that the caste of color was turned so as to correspond with the caste of work and enslave not only slaves but black men who were not slaves. So Du Bois underscored the agency of the free Negro, who not only hastened the economic crisis that killed slavery, but was now making it impossible to effect the correspondence between the caste of work and the caste of color through his own agentive actions, though these were failures ultimately, as we know. The free Negro, he argued, might be the promise and the cause of those who forced the critical revolution, that is, the transformation from slavery into wage work and slave emancipation. But he would also argue that the freedom that followed was accompanied by the imposition of a new and modern order of socioeconomic stratification. And it is to this modern order of socioeconomic stratification to which Du Bois gave the name caste or color caste. Already in a short note written in 1904, Du Bois commented on what he called, I quote, the spirit of caste that is arising in a land that was founded on the bedrock of eternal opposition to caste privileges. And what Du Bois is focusing on when he talks and uses the term caste is the concentration of power in a small elite who were blocking the routes to social mobility, especially through education. And he would argue that the Negro problem was but a sign of growing class privilege and caste distinction, in many ways overturning the argument dominant at the time, one that had been put forward again by folks located at Columbia University in the School of History here, the Dunning School, which basically placed the onus of the failure of Reconstruction on the free Negro and the inability of the free Negro to become an acquisitive individual. Black Reconstruction is written as an 800-page plus challenge to the Dunning School and the Dunning School's historical argument, the ideological and the historical argument, which sees Reconstruction as a failure predicated on, quote-unquote, Negro failure. And so for Du Bois, it is the class privilege and distinctions, the distinctions of inherited rank and so forth, that actually signal the Negro problem. Ambedkar will do something very similar when he talks about the fact that divides between purity and pollution are actually standing in, right? These are the effects of caste rather than the causes of caste. So this relationship between cause and effect and the ways in which both Du Bois and Ambedkar will challenge the relationship between the two, I think, is deeply significant. And therein also lies a certain kind of political project and a project of insurgent sociology, if you will. Right? So Du Bois is sort of taking issue with this and beginning to make an argument for mass intellectuality, challenging the idea that a vocational education would be the best way to train the free Negro into modern relations, social relations, of wage work, and so forth. So by the time he had published Black Reconstruction in America, 1860 to 1880, in 1935, Du Bois had been using the term caste, and indeed he's right to talk about effecting a revolution in the use of the term caste, for nearly 30 years. And he was using caste to refer to overlapping structures of repulsion, discrimination, exclusion, and inequality, all of them as a legacy of slavery. So the systemic argument, the structuring structure of slavery, and its incomplete emancipation. So Black Reconstruction describes a postbellum America characterized by complex practices on freedom, predicated on worker discipline, acquisitive ideology, and marketized social relations. The text locates the origins of modern racial capitalism in a legislated emancipation, ironically, followed by the institution of Jim Crow, which would mark the failure of the all too brief experiment in American democracy. Indeed, for Du Bois, the Negro problem originated with the legal freedoms announced by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. That is, we could only think racial inequality in the context of a Republican commitment, not so to equality. Haunted by its past, American democracy could only ever make an appearance as what Du Bois would call abolition democracy. This was the name that marked the intimacy between a specific history, American slavery, and a universal idea, democracy. By bringing these terms into proximity with each other, Du Bois was effecting a pithy reflection on the grounding contradictions of American democracy, its historical entanglement with enslavement and freedom. Now, Du Bois was certainly not the first to use the term caste. In the 19th century, abolitionists had become familiar with the workings of caste hierarchy through their exposure to missionary discourse. So we see Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Sojourner Truth, Alexander Crummell, and others using the term caste. It's possible that many were encouraged to explore this connection between race and caste through Catherine Impey's journal, which was operative between 1888 and 1893, and then again published in 1895, which was called Anti-Caste, and which republished and excerpted articles and speeches from newspapers from the US, England, and India, amongst other places. Publications before and after the Civil War indeed described caste as a form of inherited privilege, as what would be called an aristocracy of color. Published anonymously in 1843 by a so-called churchman, Caste and Slavery in the American Church addressed attitudes and behaviors of the church towards slavery. And this text was written, it turns out, by somebody named John Jay, and the text was prompted by the rejection of Alexander Crummell for admission to the General Theological Seminary. Now, Crummell is held up by Du Bois as his great teacher, in fact, somebody on whose shoulders he stands. Both Douglas and Crummell are sort of the predecessors to Du Bois. And the text, Caste and Slavery in the American Church, argued that the church had established a system of caste in the church. Deploying caste as a critique of racial hierarchy was a way to criticize, as I've said already, an aristocracy of color. Perhaps more famous still is Charles Sumner's 1869 lecture on caste, delivered a year before the 15th Amendment on the US Constitution, where Sumner argued that the caste claiming hereditary rank and privilege in the United States is white, the caste doomed to hereditary degradation and disability is, I quote, black or yellow, and therefore the white man is a superior caste, not unlike the Brahmin, while the black man is an inferior caste, not unlike Shudra, sometimes even the pariah. Like the word caste, the term pariah, Sumner noted, was another term imported into familiar usage to signify generally those on whom society has set its ban. Now, we know, of course, that these comparisons went the other way, and as I said, it's perhaps the comparisons going the other way with which we are most familiar, beginning with Foulé's drawing on the model of Atlantic world slavery to mark a historic conflict and a primary contradiction between Brahmins and non-Brahmins, between intellectual and manual labor, between Aryan invaders and autochthonous peoples, something that the Dravidian discourse takes up, as we know, but one that Ambedkar very strongly rejects. And Ambedkar, of course, has a complicated relationship to the question of historical comparison for drawing on it, but seeking to keep it aside. We know, of course, the conversation between Ambedkar and Du Bois in 1948 over the letter that requests copies of a petition that Du Bois had submitted to the UN by the National Negro Congress, where Ambedkar makes the argument that there was so much similarity between the position of untouchables in India and the position of Negroes in America, that the study of the latter is not only natural, but necessary, to quote him. But Ambedkar was clear, and was clear throughout his life also, that the affinities of race and caste were productive, but that caste was not race. Just as Du Bois would argue that capitalist relations had transformed race, Ambedkar too drew on the modernity of class and class thinking, whether it was a sociological understanding of class as a group formation, or indeed the Marxist understanding of class, of value, and indeed of surplus, which I'll talk about, to describe and distinguish caste. So in many ways, I wanted to suggest that the race and caste comparison, one that really has a century-plus history, is also one that has to be mediated through other modern formations, most especially capitalist relations of production and the mediating term of class, which would allow, it seems to me, to bring race and caste actually together with each other. I want to talk for the rest of my time with you about the 1916 essay Castes in India, which begins, initially written as a seminar paper for a course on primitive and modern societies, which was taught by Boaz's student Alexander Goldenweiser, and which begins to make an argument that Ambedkar will develop in other texts about both the adjacency, if you will, the affinity between race and caste, but also the ways in which this affinity, the proximity between them, the analogy between them, allows us to understand the specificity of caste and how it operates. In this text, and I'll focus probably on three terms, Those terms being endogamy, the question of surplus, and the question of imitation. So I want to read caste in India through these three terms. But we see, and we know that caste in India describes caste as an enclosed class. And the term surplus, and Ambedkar does something absolutely extraordinary in this text in the ways in which he uses the term surplus woman. But the term surplus appears in the short text 22 times. It's a text of about, about eight pages or thereabouts, maybe a few more pages. So it goes from page 81 to page 95. So it's about 14 pages long, and the term surplus appears 22 times in the short text. So I'm going to just do a close reading of caste in India as a way to get to this question of sex and the social, and then the question of historical comparison, race and caste, that I began with. And of course, what's at the heart of this, and why I think the question of race and caste and the comparison is important, is the mediating term, as I've said, of class, of modern relations, of labor and the organization of labor. But also, and underneath this relationship or comparison, is the question of the sexual, of sexuality, the control over sexuality, and its governance, the regulation of relations of gender, as the very substrate, the very making of the social. And again, I want to remind about the emergence of sociology as a discipline, and in this period, of course, the division between sociology as, especially in the North Atlantic context, sociology as a discipline that was focused on modern societies, and anthropology as a discipline that was focused on primitive societies. And Ambedkar is really situated at sort of the heart and the cusp of that. And Caste in India is a text of insurgent sociology, one that is actually engaging not so much in the question of de-abstraction, something that we're interested in now, because caste has assumed such a kind of fixity as something with a kind of common sense presence in the world. But this is really a project of theorizing caste in and through an insurgent sociology. And I think we should think very, very seriously about Du Bois, Ambedkar's claims to creating theory, right? And what it is that they're doing when they're trying to think and engage with social theory. What kinds of social theorists are they? So I just want to go into Caste in India, and I'll make a few comments about it and just read the text through and draw our attention to a few important things. Now, the text, as I said, is founded on the distinction between race and caste as similar yet distinct orders of exclusion and segregation. And Ambedkar is picking up the argument and is using a kind of culturalist argument, an argument about cultural diffusionism, and an argument about culture that he borrows to some extent from Boas, the father of American anthropology, cultural anthropology, to begin by talking about the fact that caste is not race. Right? And the argument there is that so far as race is concerned, you've got different ethnic groups or different communities, different racial groups who have a line that they cannot cross, right? That the question of sexual intimacy between them, the question of racial miscegenation, if you will, is actually marking an order of violent intimacy, and it marks a kind of breaking of a distinct barrier of group formation that has already existed. And so if someone like Du Bois is drawing attention to the fact that race itself is an order of violent intimacy, but fathers are also owners, if we think through the order of Atlantic slavery and plantation slavery, Ambedkar begins by arguing in some sense that race and caste are distinct. He will use the term enclosure, enclosing. He uses the term wall many times in this text in order to mark the idea of social separation and distinction. But the argument that he wants to put forward here is that while race difference and segregation kind of separate groups in a modern racial order, caste is an unstable and artificial system that actually produces disunity, that produces difference and distinction and disunity, which produces a lack of sociality in the context of what ought to be one people's nations. So Ambedkar begins with the telos of progress, right? The understanding, in a sense that, but he begins with the telos of progress, but he marks it through an inversion. So he wants to argue that there was intercaste contact, exogamy. There was social intercourse between people of different races, that India is actually a complex, if you will, racial ethnic formation, but that it was politics, the political will of the Brahmin, that is social power, which converted what was an open society into what Ambedkar calls an enclosed caste. So caste society is produced, as we all know, through the famous term imposition of endogamy and a prior system of exogamy. So it is actually an artificial production of asociality, of anti-sociality, of negative sociality, if you will, that caste is predicated on. In later work, Ambedkar draws on the Manusmriti and its obsessive lists and categories of persons who are a product of caste miscegenation, whether of Anuloma or Pratiloma union, as we know, the madness of Manu, as he calls it, to argue for both the historical existence of intercaste unions, as well as the fact that these histories of transgression, of a kind of caste mixing, if you will, also often further solidified the hierarchical logic of caste, of high and low, because this was constantly reproduced through the kind of patriarchal structure of men's access to women. So so gender and caste, or sexuality and caste for Ambedkar, must be thought together, but in many ways, sexuality is excessive, in a sense, to the logic of caste, we might argue. So we could, and we should remember, when we think about Ambedkar, that, so we should also keep in mind that when we think about caste in India, give me just a second, I'm sorry. I just lost my page here. Okay, so we should also recall that as we work through this text, as we work through caste in India, that Ambedkar is drawing on a particular form and development of sociology as a discipline, what we would call historical anthropology today, I suppose, which explains the origins of society and which assumes that the origin of society, the telos of social formation and social development, is a telos that moves from savage society and unregulated sexuality, giving way to marriage and family. That is, and this is a movement also from matrilineal to patrilineal, matriarchy to patriarchy, and then to the creation of society. So across the ideological divide, from Henry Louis Morgan to Edward Tyler to McLennan, whose primitive marriage is the place that first begins to open up the argument about endogamy as being essential to the understanding of caste, Bakov and even Marx. The issue was the historical transition from, as I said, matrilineal to patrilineal and private property. So the transition from primitive to modern societies is also a move towards patriarchy and private property, and that these two begin to be fused. Ambedkar is clearly aware of this broader set of stadial arguments, which saw kinship, marriage, and family as the origins of society, as a set of relations between kin and non-kin, who is within and who is without the structure of enclosure. Marriage, what feminist anthropologists would argue was the threshold between nature and culture, was also about insiders, kin, and outsiders. And what Ambedkar is doing in this extraordinary text, Caste in India, is to speak to the ways in which society, as a community of insiders, begins to put in place a set of vociferous tendencies, the making of caste, if you will, that begins to produce enclosure, that begins to create distinctive caste groups, or caste communities in different castes, as it were, in our understanding. Enabled by the control and regulation of female sexuality, the incest taboo, as well as the arguments about lineage exogamy, that is, not marrying within a gotra, giving women away in marriage, and so on and so forth. So what I suggest Ambedkar does in Caste in India is to make a contribution to social theory through the engagement with the question of sexuality, not the woman question as such. And so we could focus, as I suggested, on these two words, endogamy and surplus, on regulation and excess, as these together organize Ambedkar's explanation about caste as both inherently unstable and a somewhat schizophrenic structure that is not merely artificial but illogical, but enforced through violent regulation. So Ambedkar begins with mechanism, with how caste operates now, and in many ways tries to scroll back to origins or genesis, and then to caste's spread, its development. Caste is not, he will remind us, a division of labor. Caste is neither produced by the purity-pollution divide, nor the ban on intermarriage and commensality. Recall, as I said earlier about Du Bois, he is arguing that these are the effects of caste and not its animating cause. They exist because caste exists. So already in Caste in India, Ambedkar has taken down, even before it has been fully erected, an entire set of arguments, right? So whether we think about people like Bugle or Senart, or we come to someone like Dumont that I began with, what Ambedkar is telling us is that all of the rules, the protocols, the regulations through which we come to understand caste, the divide of purity pollution, commensality, intermarriage, that these are all effects rather than the cause of caste. Rather, Ambedkar argues, it is endogamy and endogamy only, the regulation of reproduction, and hence the name of the father and the caste of the child, through the control of marriage, that is the defining principle of caste. So unlike racial endogamy, which further secures racial segregation, caste produces enclosure, zones of containment artificially. So this idea about caste as enclosed class is both about the setting up of a structure and its inherently unstable foundation. Because what endogamy does is to produce a problem for homeostatic conceptions of society, where every man has access to a woman from within his caste. Right? So we'll recall that Ambedkar makes the argument that the only mechanism that can explain caste is the idea of endogamy, and that the only mechanism that can explain caste is the ways in which endogamy is structured on or is placed on top of exogamy, right? And that this is an act, A, of social power, B, it is an act of the social power of Brahmins who put in place a structure that others wish to emulate or imitate. And here, the argument that Ambedkar wants to make about the ways in which caste reproduces itself through a kind of repetitive regularity is drawing very much on Gabriel Tard and his notion of imitation, that social imitation can actually produce both social differentiation and the repetitive regularity of something that we might call society, or in the case of caste, an asocial sociality. Caste is vociferous from the very get-go, that it is the impossibility of creating the social that caste stands in for. Right? So this engagement, in a sense, with social theory and sociological thinking produces caste as the obverse to what everybody seeks to understand, which is how are consensual social relations operative? How are they produced? Instead, Ambedkar gives to us its absolute obverse. Second, as I said, the argument about endogamy produces this very interesting argument about the ways in which castes seek to maintain a numerical relationship of equality between the sexes, right? And the fact that this is from the very get-go unstable. So the problem of the surplus woman is actually also the problem of the reproduction of caste, but it is also the problem that haunts the idea of endogamy itself. Now, the surplus woman is the one who doesn't have a partner she can marry. So these are women who then must be killed off, sati, or otherwise controlled to widowhood and social death, stripped of desire or being desired, while excess men, right? So women, in a sense, in this world will become disposable, so the surplus woman. So the idea of endogamy as inherently unstable because it is predicated on both the notion of regularity and excess, right? Regularity and surplus. So these women, in a sense, then have to be killed off, as Ambedkar tells us, while the excess man is not disposable, precisely because he is a productive being, he maintains lineage, and therefore he is married off to girls. So child marriage, widowhood, social death, and the actual killing, the explicit violence and violation of women, their very bodies and their existence, is fundamental to the ways in which caste's logic operates. So women must endure physical and social death in order for caste endogamy, in fact, what is known as caste, as such, to function. So in a sense, so the annihilation of caste, we might say, is also the annihilation of an order, a heteronormative patriarchal order, that these are predicated the one on the other. So what Ambedkar seems to be suggesting here is that caste's dysfunctionality is both belated and, as I've said, a sign of the impossibility of the social. And maybe I can leave it here and just think a little bit through what the consequence or what the import of the kinds of arguments that Ambedkar begins to make here might really mean for us when we start thinking about the question of the social, sociality, and sociability. So already in this early text, Ambedkar has spoken about caste as aberrant, as secured by social power, caste itself as vociferous, right, predicated on a form of vociferous outcasting, if you will, where those who are refuse, in a sense, to live by the order of caste and endogamy, themselves appear or cast out into new caste groupings that are themselves stigmatized. So this is how he will explain the creation of new castes and the ways in which, again, speaking of the madness of Manu and the Manusmriti must actually catalog and categorize this proliferation of castes, right? Something which suggests actually that the ordering of caste is impossible from the get-go. There must have always been social intercourse across caste. There must have been sexual miscegenation, caste miscegenation, if you will, from the very get-go. But that the way that these new groups are maintained is through the kind of hierarchical ordering of caste. And I think very importantly as well, Ambedkar implicates everybody and all castes in the logic and the ordering of caste. So nobody gets away, in some sense, scot-free. This is not an argument about victimhood. This is not an argument about the kind of ethical position, if you will, of the subaltern. Because the argument that Ambedkar also seems to be making here is that caste, because it operates as an order of imitation, because it operates on an order, and he says at some point in Caste in India that, Brahmins clearly did not have the power to actually enforce the logic of caste on every other caste group. So somewhere it is this imitative force that actually embeds or renders everybody complicit in the reproduction of the caste caste order. So, imitation closest to those closest to Brahmins, as we know, it becomes, ever more indistinct and muffled, if you will, the further away from the Brahmin one moves, so that there is far greater, you could say, capacity for movement, mobility, experimentation, if you will, amongst the lower castes and certainly the untouchable castes, but that it is this order of imitation that actually sutures caste together. And in that sense, the logic, coming back to the question of the social or the impossibility of the social, the logic of imitation is what produces this very complicated structure, something that Ambedkar will outline in 35 in the Annihilation of Caste. It is what produces this ascending scale of reverence and the descending scale of contempt, where there is no simple divide between equality, inequality, upper caste and lower caste, but that this law of imitation and imitative ordering of caste actually means that everybody is complicit in it. So now it seems to me the question, right, and this is why also Ambedkar has to come to the project of annihilation, and he has to think about a kind of new subject in his later writings as a way to move away from this ordering of caste, this way in which caste logic comes to be structured, right? That there can be no annihilation, as I said, without also an annihilation of the regulative sexual ordering of caste, but that there can be no annihilation of caste which doesn't challenge everybody's implication in the caste order. So I think I will just leave it there and suggest that, when we are thinking about this question of the social, to go back and think about the birth of disciplines, to think through the institutional and the intellectual history of sociology, and the kind of insurgent sociology that the young Ambedkar at the age of 25 is already in some sense practicing, might be worthwhile or might be a worthy starting point for a broader conversation. So I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Anupama Rao, for this fascinating, rich discussion, and practically as all of you will be definitely you will understand that it's really not possible to comment in a certain way on this talk, which has brought up so many issues, and not only brought up issues, but bound them intricately with each other, and has been so rich, not only in its scope, but also in its analysis. So I will just try to hello?
Yeah, can I just say you something? You need to speak into the mic.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, that's it.
Now, am I being heard? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what I just want to say is that this was a fascinating talk, and which was rich both in its scope and its analysis, and so what I will not try to comment on what it has been speaking of, or whether I agree with them or not. I'll just try to think of 3 or 4 themes that seem to me were brought up in the talk, and which I feel to be very important for the discussion on caste and everything. So I'll just begin. The first thing that struck me was this whole theme that was running through the whole talk, and that was the notion of the impossibility of the social. I was reminded of as many of you would definitely be of that small essay by Ernesto Laclau, who was talking of the impossibility of the social to begin with, and how the social is then to be, in a way, sutured into through various it's not contrary, a certain ethics and the politics. Excuse me. Excuse me.
Anirban, we could not hear you. You froze for a while.
Oh, just I'm trying to.
So can you just repeat what you were saying?
Yeah, just repeat that.
Like I was talking about that Laclau's essay, the impossibility of the social. Let me get rid of this. Am I now being heard?
Yes. Anirban.
Now, yeah. So maybe without the mic, it's better. So what I was thinking, what I was reminded of was this very interesting essay by Ernesto Laclau on the impossibility of the social, and I definitely do not see like this essay and the today's talk being like absolutely congruent on the issue, but what I find very interesting is the way this is talking about the making possible of the social, the violence that is involved in the making possible of the social, and the question of an ethics and a politics which tries to address that violence, which tries to even if not get rid, but at least minimize the violence involved in the making of the social, though the social still remains impossible. So let me talk about these themes that I see to be running through. The first theme, and I would refer here to the question which has been coming up again and again in this seminar, in this conference, from the first day on, and that is the age-old theme of experience and structure, the theme of, in a way, abstraction and immanence, where, if we remember how in the work of Gopal Guru and Sundar Sarukkai, they were talking of experience as something which comes before the social in an ontological sense, before not in a temporal sequence, but in an ontological sense, something which one has to go back to in order to question the theorizings, the rational theorizings that go with the dominant. So that was one way of thinking of the question of caste through experience, and they were insistent that the everyday experience is something which is in such a relationship of immanence to the abstraction of the dominant mode of thinking. So from there, we are today thinking of how that sort of experience and sort of thinking in terms of structure, they relate to each other. And like I'll come back to this. Before that, I'll just try to think of how the whole question of caste and gender, which has been central in today's talk, that has been very much important in thinking of these structure of caste and structure of gender. Like if we think of how caste and gender have been thought of in especially in Indian academia. If you remember, in the 1990s, the relations between feminism and caste activism were thought not only in terms of their mutual affinities, but more importantly in terms of the tensions between them. And if again one remembers that very famous essay by Susi Tharu and Tejaswini Niranjana, Problems for a Contemporary Theory of Gender, they have been speaking of the multiple ways in which concerns of caste discriminations had been interrupting women's issues and vice versa. For example, they were talking of how the hegemonic articulation of gender issues, maybe something like this, the hegemonic articulations of gender issues, they were acting against the way in which the caste and other hierarchical axes were being active in society, and whereas hegemonic articulations of gender issues, they went more in terms of they were articulating themselves more in terms of consumer capitalism, and where they were acting against the, say, the activist impulses in caste or class. And also, like something, they themselves were talking of how they were like primarily concerned with the exploration of factors that disable alliances between feminism and other democratic political initiatives, and which really, through which, what they were really trying to do was to think of how to access the democratic potential of actually existing feminism. And I'll not go into detail, like we all know about this, how through the figures of the woman subject and figures of democracy and socialism, they were trying to think of the links between gender and caste, links between feminism and caste activism in a certain way. So one way of coming out of this had been in feminist and Dalit feminist, especially Dalit feminist literature in the academia. One way of coming out of this had been through accounts of how in Dalit women, caste atrocities and gender discriminations come together. This event, on the one hand, raised questions of the limitations of mainstream feminisms and of the patriarchal assumptions of many Dalit movements. On the other, focused on the possibilities of the new subjects of Dalit feminism. So this was one way of thinking beyond the interruptions of caste and gender. And Anupama Rao has been one of those exceptional theorists, and we also like heard in today's talk that who has addressed these questions at a structural level, linking them to the empirical realities at hand. And what we mean by this structural level is that that the way gender hierarchies and caste hierarchies, they constitute each other, they produce each other in a mutually constitutive way. So this is one very important way to think about the whole caste gender system in where what like Ritu here. I'm reminded of her work immensely in this respect, because she has been working on this for quite some time now, and like I through especially a discussion on that very important essay, Caste in India, the mechanism, genesis and development, as like today Professor Rao has talked about this. Ambedkar, in the course of his arguments with other caste scholars, he theorizes the origin, the range, the apparatus of caste and its implications for gender relations in Hindu society. She has already talked about this in detail, so I will not go into detailed explication of that here, and just underline that for Ambedkar, the logical demands of endogamy is the maintenance of a constant sex ratio within caste, already discussed here, and like through the concept of surplus women, as she has already talked about. The points that I want to like just underline here is again following Ritu's discussions in her like writings on this are certain very interesting points. One is like that endogamy institutes the authority of the Brahman man in terms of the differential treatment of the surplus man and woman, which Professor Rao has already talked about. Second, the resolution of the question of surplus woman in terms of Shoti, enforced widowhood and girl marriage, entails a control of women's sexuality. So, like, it is not only that, like, it's not only a question of gender roles, but a question of sexuality, of violence over sexuality that is operative here. And if one remembers that how this discussion is very near to the discussion of say someone like Rubin, who has been speaking of the sex gender system as a certain set of arrangements by which the like naturalized biological raw material of human sex is shaped by human social intervention of gender roles. And there also, like Ritu has talked about how the caste gender sexuality system may be theorized as something which works through this. So, like one very important aspect which has been talked about here is this aspect of the structural co-constitution of caste and gender, which acts in making the society possible, retaining the forces of impossibility, almost stretching out the forces of impossibility that run through society. And I think with that, the other element that has been talked of, that is the question of sociology as a discipline and caste as a sort of a social event in a certain way, and how that is related to a certain mode of ethics. And the very important about which practically I cannot off the cuff comment on now is the relationship between caste and race. The way in which like caste may be seen to be the one of the very important elements that deal with again that impossible social in a certain way, which may provide some light on the workings of race. Like I want to raise just one point here, which is related, and where I see this question of race on the one hand, and not not caste as in studies of caste that is prevalent in the academia today, but in a broad sense the question of caste and class hierarchies, how these are related to ethics. I'm again reminded of it may seem to be a little off the mark, but still I'm really reminded of that very interesting essay by Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak called Ethics and Politics in Tagore, Poetry and the Certain Scenes of Teaching, where she talks about certain ethical, political aspects which appear in the question of race in disgrace, and in her attempts to work on education in a hierarchized space, where she talks about certain experiences with girls who were being taught in schools for teachers, local teachers in distant villages in West Bengal, where again she brought in the question of literariness, the notion of literature being active in a certain training of imagination, which Spivak talks about in multiple occasions, and here in our seminar, like Shubhro has already talked about yesterday. So, in a certain way, these becomes again I just want to finish off my comment here for the moment, of how on the one hand the notion of the impossibility of the social leading on to a certain acts of suturing, which can lead us one into thinking of a certain ethics and politics, which work across these acts of sutured society, and where these ethics and politics, they have to retain the force of impossibility while working meticulously through the very real and possible worlds that are around us. And caste, the questions of caste, through questions of embodiment, through experience, and through the structural dynamic that produce these impossible social in terms of certain possibilities. I think that becomes very important in that juncture. And I thank you. And I now I will open the discussion to other questions, comments, and definitely Professor Rao's responses to the questions and comments. Thank you. Yeah. And once again, thanks to Professor Rao for this extremely fascinating, extremely rich discussion.
Thank you so much. Ritu, I guess I'll wait to see if there are comments and so on, right?
Maybe. So we are actually inviting questions from the house. And Anirban, I have sent you a few questions.
Acha.
So you can have a look and you can just read them out, stating who has asked the question. And actually, from the floor now, we'll invite questions from the floor now.
May I?
Shamrat.
Yeah, it was really a fascinating lecture. I was so excited. I would like to hear more about it, but I was just wondering how to address the question of pleasure and its relationship with a kind of casteism, because whenever we deal with the caste narratives, there is a flip side of it, that on one hand we talk about the casteism as a kind of social oppression, and as Professor Rao has rightly pointed out, a kind of asociality which is mediated through sexual and social regulation. But on the other hand, when we describe the experiences, mainly they are about oppression, suffering, and a lack of pleasure. As a literary scholar, when I read the narratives, and also as a from a social anthropological point of view, when I read the narratives, the life stories of Dalit individuals, of people from marginalized caste, what occurs to me is the repetition of this narrative of suffering, which talks about a lack of pleasure. So my question is how to theoretically, politically, and narratively it is possible to address the question of pleasure vis-a-vis this sexual regulation and control. Thank you.
Do you want me to take these on, or?
Maybe we wait for one or two more questions, but if there are not, then we'll. So any other questions, comments? Shubhro, yeah.
Shubhra, you are not audible.
Shubhro, we cannot hear you.
Yeah, maybe we can take up other questions and we'll wait for Shubhro.
Yeah. Srirupa? Okay.
Nothing now.
Should I go ahead?
Yes. And there is just one other question here. I can read it out for you. It is in YouTube. Do you think reservation policy is helpful in reducing caste-based inequalities?
Okay. I suppose if that's a yes or no, yes. Because I think the reservation policies question I can just take on, I think reasonably quickly, because I think, reservations themselves have been, and I've argued this elsewhere, that they function as projects of equalization, right? So what they seek to do is to create a set of policies, again, going back to the question of sort of the state and state republicanism of some sort, if one thinks about India as a republic, then certainly I think the kind of public project of producing equality means that these are all projects of equalization, right? In what ways do you render incommensurable or unequal subjects equal in the domains where the question of equity matters, right? So, which is to say, things such as access to education, access to jobs. So, these are all ways also to think about projects of equalization as future-oriented projects, right? This is about acknowledging historic discrimination and then, in a sense, making a space for projects of remediation into the future. So there's a very interesting relationship also in reservation policy between a kind of understanding of the historical past as a past that has produced discrimination, that has produced and perpetrated inherited privilege, right? So that caste is a kind of capital, right? So if you're upper caste, etc., there is a way in which historically caste privilege moves, generationally, you might say, but it also leads to certain very distinct and measurable effects in the here and now. So I think reservations policy, in the sense that, they seek to kind of remedy for a past of discrimination with a kind of future which sets up a potentially a level playing field, whether it seeks to produce equality of opportunity or equality of outcome. And the Indian state used to be invested in thinking about and had given to itself the project of thinking through the equality of outcome, right? We are going to be able to produce and render everybody or people equal to each other, rather than merely opening up a space where, so long as there is, social mobility, let the chips fall where they may, but we at least produce that kind of, opening grounds of the possibility of either social mobility or equality of outcomes between those who are unequal. So in that sense, yes, I think reservations policies are, they are certainly not perfect. They have certainly not been implemented in any sense with the rigor and the robustness that one would imagine or wish for, but as they are articulated as a particular state project of producing equality and creating and making possible equality for unequal citizens, I think it's a deeply significant project. So as a broader project of affirmative action, yes, I think they are important. Now, the fact that, in some sense, reservation policies themselves have, as I said, moved away, and this has been an argument that's been made, that, as we move away from those who are, you might say, sort of truly discriminated or truly deserving, right? And you start moving into a domain where reservation policies have actually shifted focus away from those communities. And we are now thinking about, Marathas and reservations for Marathas, or, Jats and so on and so forth. What we have is a project, it seems to me, of imagining equality as now a project of creating a kind of parity. And those are different kinds of aims, it seems to me. Right, and they stand in a kind of different relationship to each other in terms of a kind of rather different understanding also of society. So the idea of affirmative action is to think through historic inequality. the project, you might say, of something like multiculturalism, which says that, we have multi-ethnic, multi-religious, etc. communities, is the project of parity. How do we create equivalence amongst these different communities? Those are quite different projects. They implicate the state in a very different understanding of history, and they implicate the state in a very different relationship to its management of resources, scarce resources, right? Material resources. So that would be one. The question about pleasure, I think this is a very, very interesting question. And one could answer this in sort of two ways, I suppose. One is, of course, the fact that, and Aniket Zaure has made this point as well, that as you began to see the burgeoning, as it were, of Dalit self-writing, autobiographical narratives about the community and so on and so forth, these took on the shape of a kind of Bildungsroman, right? So there is a movement out of suffering, of social suffering, of kind of absolute destitution, of humiliation that one comes into, and very often it is through, indeed, an engagement with Ambedkar's thought. It is through an engagement with schooling. It is through projects of kind of social reform, really quite radical projects of social reform within the community and so on. But almost all Dalit self-writing now also, we have to think, and you're speaking as somebody who's a literary person, one does have to think about generic regularities, right? The genres do tend to have certain forms of regularity. One reads those into those texts. So I think it's certainly the case that certainly much of the Dalit self-writing did focus on those questions of social suffering and humiliation. But it's also the case, it seems to me, that one could think rather differently about some other forms of writing, not just self-writing. But I'll come to that in a second. Now, the other problem, and I'm speaking from the context of Maharashtra, where there was, speaking of pleasure and speaking of questions of sexuality and pleasure as well, there was a very there's a very major investment as one begins to think about remaking the Dalit self and so on. There's a quite significant investment on the part of modern Dalits in rejecting pasts of other kinds of pleasure. That's why I said I think this is a very, very interesting question. It's also a question like the previous one about how do we think temporality, history, the archaic, and so on. But Ambedkar himself certainly has no place for performative traditions that he sees also to be in and of themselves stigmatizing. So you could think about things like tamasha and so on. So tamasha seen by upper caste, etc., in a certain stigmatizing way. That is, that these are forms of, these are pleasurable practices. There are forms of embodied performance that are also about access to lower caste women, to Dalit women, and so on. That would be one way to read it. You can see members of the community, modern Dalits, often modern Dalit men, who are deeply embarrassed. There's a kind of social embarrassment about the fact that these traditions endure. And so I think you're also seeing a lot of disciplining within the community around some of these, what you call pleasurable practices. They're not only about reading for pleasure, but I think they're also about performing for pleasure. They're also about inhabiting places, and they're about inhabiting certain kinds of language, right, and linguistic worlds, which are also very profound sort of thought worlds, right? So if you are enmeshed in performative traditions where languages of submission, right, languages in a sense of a kind of self-destitution are aesthetically freighted. They're not just, sociologically freighted, one may say. But if those are aesthetically freighted, and they're deeply enabling for the enduring of those performative traditions, for those literary cultures and so on. And you've suddenly got certain kinds of modern or modernizing discourses. This is about, social inequality. This is about, performing our stigma. This is about, modern way forward into new domains where, we can think of ourselves as self-respecting, perhaps, subjects who can think through pleasure and so on. Then I think it produces also a very, very, very difficult problem within the community itself. And you really do see this happening, especially around things such as, Lavani, Tamasha, and other forms of performance that really are about, practices of the body, the practices of sound and song and so on. And so in that sense, they are literary in a very wide scope. So I think this is, this is a kind of interesting question, where then would one find pleasure? One, this tradition of sort of Dalit self-writing, autobiographical writing, and whether there is a place for pleasure there. And certainly one could read against the text there, I suppose, and find places where one could read for pleasure. One could read for forms of social engagement that are what we might call fugitive, and that are opening up access to other kinds of spaces and domains that these somewhat modernizing and in their own ways kind of disciplining narratives, righteous narratives, self-righteous narratives might not open up. And then, as I said, there is the fact that, there are entire forms, traditional forms and practices that just get pushed aside. And I think this really happens, and I see this very much in the context of Maharashtra, that those traditions are just set aside. They're part of a past. They're part of a past that, actually shouldn't be acknowledged. And the movement is into something. So whether it is, the Navayana Buddhism, whether it is the remaking of the new self, and so on and so forth, it is that movement into a new kind of a space. So where do we read for pleasure? Perhaps we read for pleasure in those past practices, performative practices. Perhaps we also read for pleasure in terms of the ways in which language and kind of linguistic registers are capable of, in a sense, bearing the kind of porosity of pain and pleasure. So you could see this with somebody like Baburao Bagul and so on, where, ostensibly the narrative is about a kind of subaltern life. It's about, precarity. It's about sort of, spaces that are teeming with a kind of, a multitude, a destitute and really a kind of impoverished multitude. But there are moments of engagement, and it might actually be coming back to the question of the social and sociality. I think it's those moments of a kind of unexpected, random, fleeting, fugitive social engagement, a turn of phrase and so forth, where I think one could begin to read perhaps with pleasure. But I think this is a very, very important kind of a question, right? Because it is also kind of counterposing the making of a certain kind of political and indeed a kind of sociological, you might say, Dalit self, and counterposing that to perhaps a kind of a deeper and a kind of broader history. And, this is something that I also confronted when I was working on this R.B. More, the autobiography and the biography. And this is an interesting text because the father writes a autobiography, R.B. More does, that ends in 1924. He starts writing it before he passes away in 1972. And then the son ends up sort of, writing the father's life, as a biography, as a communist biography in many ways. And what's very interesting is that, More himself, when he writes, is writing about religious traditions, about the ways in which, all of the castes come together for certain rituals and so on. And, or he will talk about being in the city. And those are really spaces where there is a great deal of pleasure. There's just the pleasure of wandering into the city that you don't know about, encountering, kind of modern accoutrements and implements, and, just kind of being in the world of machines and so on. And I think there's a great deal of pleasure there. And then you see the son's kind of, biography, the communist biography that gets written. And all of this gets kind of bleached out, because what you end up having is a certain kind of, theoretical language that has to explain, how the father came into his politics, what his beliefs were, and so on. And so that entire opening that the father himself provides, because he's sort of, in the city, he's experiencing a mode of newness, right? All of that sort of gets leached out. So I think this is quite an interesting and an important question to kind of pursue further. And just to say that, I'm a fellow traveler, I think it's something that we do need to kind of think about. It also means, when we think about questions of pleasure and so on, can we really also divide that from, or distinguish them from, forms of, kind of violent intimacies and forms of what we may think of as everyday violence and so on? Can we distinguish that from them, or do we have to find another way of making an adjustment with those worlds as well? So I think I'll just say that, and finally with Professor Das's comments, really picking up with the question of the impossibility of the social, the question of kind of abstraction and immanence, and where are we in terms of theorizing caste between these two spaces, and really thinking about, in a sense, the present of caste politics against the kind of social theory that Ambedkar is trying to produce, right? He's inserting, in a sense, caste very significantly into global social theory, and he wants to say, hey, listen, here I am sitting in a room discussing, in a seminar about primitive and modern societies. This is written in 1916. It's at the very, very inception of sociology as an institutional discipline. And we've had a sort of tradition in the 19th century of, armchair anthropologists, as we will, call them now, going out and thinking about, social organization in primitive societies. Is this going to be the kula? Is this going to be, endogamy and caste? Is this going to be, other structures of giving and transaction, right? The gift and so on and so forth. So, Mose versus, you could say Marx and so forth, right? The gift versus the commodity and so on. So, so there has been that kind of, earlier history, but it's really the moment where sociology is being institutionalized. And Ambedkar is making a play. It's like Du Bois writing, sociology hesitant, right? Which is to say that you engage with all of your pertinences. I mean, Ambedkar is using, turn of the century language when he's writing Caste in India. And there's no way to get away from that. But yet, he's thinking about this, with a difference, right? That this is not about consensual, homeostatic, social formations, things that can reproduce, that can kind of occur regularly in terms of a project of social reproduction. This is actually about vociferousness and about division in the deepest sense, social division, that actually allows something that looks like society to continue. I mean, on the face of it, caste should not be able to continue. It is completely irrational. It is illogical, right? There is actually no logic for instituting a structure of differentiation of this order, this radical order, in a community that, as Ambedkar tells us, was unified, right? Which is a community in indifference, created through difference. But yet it produces. So how do we explain? So I think that kind of a question of, the institutionalization of sociology, it seems to me, is slightly different from the question of caste politics today, which is something else that Professor Das also brought up. And maybe I'll just, just to be brief, I'll just note that one of the things, and maybe the caste politics today, etc., very often tries to say, well, let's think through a kind of intersectional logic, right? So the idea of intersectionality, let's think caste and gender, let's think caste, class, gender, and so on. Ambedkar is actually, from the very get-go, refusing that kind of a model of intersectionality. It's not about overlapping structures or analytics that can help to better explain each other. He's actually working he's making a very different kind of an argument about the relationship between caste and sexuality, where sexuality is both absolutely essential for caste, but it also somehow doesn't seem to be encompassed or capable of fully explaining it. So this is a kind of model of a sort of both excess and insufficiency, if you will, that Ambedkar is dealing with. And that might be interesting for us to think about in terms of our politics today and the kind of ethical questions that Professor Das also kind of opened up. How do we think about, ethics and politics in terms of the current conversation about caste? And, whether a text from 1916, which is really trying to think through a kind of a precise use of sociological terms and categories, and then tries to create something that's systemic from that. What relationship that past of sociological thinking has to the presence of caste is, I think, an open question still, it seems to me. I certainly don't have anything but a kind of provisional answer to that, except to say that I think many of the questions and the comments suggest that to work with the domain of the political as we know it is clearly insufficient for the kinds of everyday engagements and the depth, in some sense, also of the kind of the social violence, the social suffering, but also in some sense the social necessity of being with caste today that we see.
Shubhro, why don't you go ahead with your question, and then I'll I really, think there's a lot to think about what Shomrat asked and what Professor Rao just talked about. So maybe you go ahead first, and then I will bring that question of pleasure back.
Is it audible now?
Yes.
Yeah. There was a bit of problem. Sorry for that. It was really a fascinating lecture, and I always know I grew up reading Anupama Rao's works, and in that same way, it's that same fascinating push that is coming to rethink Ambedkar and how we approach Ambedkar. That is already there. Now, I was just thinking, it's not a question; it's more of a kind of an observation and pushing forward to the argument that Professor Rao has already pushed and explored. I was thinking about Arjun Appadurai's response to Wilkinson's book that was referred, and Appadurai was talking about just a small response that was there in Wire, that from an anthropologist's point of view, Appadurai was pushing it towards a kind of displacement, which very poignantly has already been mentioned here by Professor Rao. And I was thinking that when one is trying to read caste, specifically in this kind of cases, where caste is read in relation to race, there is there is a kind of a metaphorical engagement where there is also a danger of displacement. Like, what I'm trying to say is that there is this tendency to situate caste as a pre-modern kind of organization through which colonialism, colonial anthropology had worked to show a certain form of cultural difference, a certain form of emphasizing on difference. So on the one way, the caste question was addressed or explained within colonial anthropology as a way of emphasizing on colonial difference, and as if and thereby this tendency to situate a kind of an irrational, a kind of incapacity to rationalize, those kind of questions have come. Now, when we see in the thinking of race, caste is being kind of brought in a generalized way, while I feel there is a kind of a double ness, that on the one hand, while it is necessary that caste may offer other important questions, larger questions to address, as Ambedkar in that essay rightly talks about the question of surplus body, endogamy, and the control of woman's body, widow, and the regulation of bodies. But also there is as if that lurking, that danger lurking, that as if in that kind of a comparative move, as if in that kind of a metaphorical reading, there is also a danger of practicing some other forms of violence, other forms of exclusion, reinstating different forms of exclusion. Let's say again a presentation of Indian society practicing caste through the kind of a generalized colonial anthropology's view. So as if, though it is trying to address the racial question, it is as if repeating different other forms of, or opening possibilities of other forms of recurring displacements, which also we need to be cautious of, that while we try to ensure, like while trying to address or solve one problem, are we not as if opening up possibilities of newer kind of problems to emerge through that kind of lens? And that is where, like, I'm asking that what your view is specifically regarding epistemological necessity to engage with such caution and such specificities while we go into a kind of a comparative engagement by studying or understanding one in terms of other. Definitely one can help it to understand other questions, but also, not reducing or not enabling it to other forms of exclusion or other forms of displacement.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I mean, I think the simple response would be, or my simple response would be, in some sense to always historicize, right? That, and what I've really tried, I think, to present is, it's almost as if, there is it's a double helix, right? So there are moments where the race caste conversation meet and might actually be useful in terms of, allowing us to kind of read supplementally, I suppose would be the way to think about it. And then there are other moments where clearly, they don't work. And some part of this would actually be to go back and think, in some genealogical sense about, what are the moments where this actually happens. And this comes back, I think, in some ways, maybe also to this interesting question about kind of language and aesthetics and enjoyment and so on. But, one moment is the moment where there is a kind of religious conception of the human. So missionary discourses are a very, very important moment where this kind of race caste link begins to converge. So it's really with different ways of thinking the question of the universal, right? So I mean, Christianity has a certain notion of, sort of God and God's creatures and human beings and kind of, egalitarianism that is built into that structure of Christian thinking in this period, certainly, or missionary thinking. In its better versions and so on. So, those are moments where it seems to me that the question of difference, that's why I said that, there's always the question of sort of mediation as well, right? So what's the kind of mediating term for thinking, race and caste? If each of these are systemic in some sense, they exhibit forms of, historical regularity. So as I said, slavery becomes, in a sense, the grounds for thinking the relationship between the economic, the social, and the political. For Ambedkar, as he comes into a more fully sketched out argument about Brahmanism, we see this already with 1935, with the annihilation of caste. He is also beginning to think about Brahmanism in history as a kind of structuring structure, right? And so if we're thinking about these two kind of, systems in some sense that have certain forms of regularity, that have certain ways of creating social totality and so on and so forth, then surely there has to be something that kind of mediates. That would be one other way. So conceptually, there's got to be some mediating term. It seems to me that historically one can think about this double helix kind of a mode, that there are moments where these things come into conversation with each other. So as I said, we can think about, what missionary discourse and its imagination of sort of the human being does. The other moment, certainly, and the most significant one, it seems to me, is the way that, kind of Marxist internationalism, both sort of drawing from its own histories of, kind of liberalism and republicanism and so on, the kind of, however you want to think about, Marx and Marxist thought, either as the best exemplar, if you will, of liberal thinking of a sort, or as a radical challenge to it. I think the Marxist notion of emancipation is another moment where, it's another kind of mediating moment. That's why I kept sort of trying to talk about questions of class, questions of labor, and so on and so forth, as a way of thinking, kind of embodiment. Labor universalism is a way of thinking about, the embodiment of labor as such. And once you introduce that concept, then you have to think about the question of caste and degraded labor or racial capital, as the case may be, in a slightly different way, because that becomes the kind of, the thinking of the kind of universal that then puts the problem of difference or inequality in a very different light. So I think that's probably how I would respond to your question, that, one can offer a kind of conceptual history, one can also offer a certain kind of social or a political history, or a history of even disciplines. But this kind of always historicized point for what's the value of thinking about race and caste. It's not always valuable, right? Or it's only valuable because, you seek to explore X question. So in this particular case, I think the question is that, we tend to think about race as the world historical, right? That race and racial difference is formed in the crucible of kind of Enlightenment thought and so forth. So whether it's the kind of scientific notion of race and racial difference, biological, scientific, or we think about kind of racial difference in this kind of cultural sense that, anthropology, sociology is beginning to put in place, that one has tended to think about race as world historical. Well, what if we flip the argument and suggest that something that was seen to be, or that we also have thought, has to be historicized because it was seen as archaic? What if that archaic nature, that pre-modern character of caste, was actually seen as doing a certain kind of very important intellectual work? I mean, we have over a century of, anti-race thinkers thinking through caste. And so, if we kind of flip that narrative and we historicize how that is taking shape, then I think, as I suggested, we see the moment of missionization, we see the kind of Christian discourse of egalitarianism, we see a certain kind of Marxist discourse of egalitarianism as two very important moments where the race-caste connection perhaps can be thought of differently. So I think that would be the, historicize, think about disciplinary formation, think about the ways in which categories themselves are formed and the kind of work that they're doing. And so for me, as somebody who's trained in historical anthropology, also it was very interesting, and I've always done this in bibs and bobs, I suppose, but to really go back and say, oh my goodness, what was happening with the formation of sociology as a discipline in the United States, and especially Columbia, because it's got such an interesting history amongst the other Ivy Leagues. Columbia was always seen as a bit of an outlier. It's the place that actually, allows, Jews to come into the university quite early on. It has a connection with the settlement house and certain kinds of projects of social reform in the city, urban uplift, and so on as well. Columbia and the formation of disciplines, the social science disciplines in the period that Ambedkar is here, has a very interesting and important connection, for instance, with the LSE, the other place that he goes to, because these are both places, if you think about people like Seligman, or Dewey, or Canaan, and others who are sitting at LSE, this is the moment where, they're all engaging, in a sense, with the great, either the threat or the possibility, the potential of Marxism, by engaging in a kind of, radical social democratic thinking. So progressivism into progressivism across the seas, across the pond, if you will. All of that, I think, opens up and allows for a different mode of historicization, perhaps, than what we're used to. If you just think about, going back and thinking about Ambedkar without also locating the young Ambedkar in his context, and without seeing how much he shaped some of the terms and the categories that are operating at that time.
I think Srirupa, you can ask your question.
If there is, if there are other questions, I can wait. But if there are,
No, you continue.
Okay. I really found Shamrat's question very productive to kind of connect to this absolutely fascinating paper and body of a broader work that Professor Rao is doing and just presented to us, and kind of connect Shamrat's question to Professor Rao's work to kind of some of the broader discussions we have been having over the last 2 days. And I was I was just trying to think when Shamrat asked the question about pleasure. And I mean, how do we talk about pleasure in kind of a social, cultural, political landscape that is kind of at its core defined by suffering, pain, death, injury, and mourning. And number two, can we talk about pleasure also as this link or this kind of, I come back to this, middle ground, to this, kind of the underbelly, but very powerful underbelly that kind of contains the possibility of a futurity, of an alterity, whether pleasure can be that link between a set of kind of binaries, which, yes, we engage with for kind of intellectual reasons, analytical reasons, but they are also false in the sense that they are deeply porous. So structure, agency, caste as an overarching structure versus caste as this set of deeply embodied everyday practices. And I was just wondering, how do we talk about pleasure? And by pleasure, I don't only mean, and this is something I really have gotten from kind of, queer feminist, kind of Black studies, where pleasure is not only to be looked at as a site of cultural production or only, we need not study pleasure only through or only as a means of cultural production. And that many times, particularly in Black feminist queer theory, for a long time, it has been kind of the most important paradigmatic mode to understand kind of Black pleasure. And in recent years, queer feminist thought, Black feminist thought particularly, who are engaging with queer phenomenology, kind of feminist materialisms, they have tried to talk about pleasure really in terms of erotics not only in a very limited way, but erotics as a way to what Audre Lorde talks about, what Jose Esteban Munoz talks about, kind of going out of here and now. Pleasure is something that it's kind of a promise, a possibility of a futurity. And whether that pleasure is, and he writes it beautifully in this identifications, that this is pleasure that it's a way of stepping out of the here and now. And I just read a couple of lines from Audre Lorde's, she talks about what is queer Black feminist pleasure. What is that erotics? And I was just thinking some of the things that you said, Anupama, about, kind of connecting these two kind of binaries, and we have been talking about. I'll just quickly read it. So just give me a second. This is a piece she wrote in The Uses of the Erotic. And she says that deep and irreplaceable knowledge of my capacity for joy comes to demand from all of my life that it be lived within the knowledge that such satisfaction is possible and does not have to be called marriage, nor God, nor an afterlife. And I think this is just profound, which talks about a possibility not only kind of outside of pain, suffering, mourning, and death, but because of that mourning and death and suffering, that, for example, or kind of this, death as kind of defining the very core of subjectivity. And I just wonder whether the kind of deeply granular and just fabulous kind of description that you did through the archive or as an anthropologist, as through an ethnography, whether these are some of the ways we can kind of dig up those life worlds, which can kind of open up these worlds of kind of, erotics, pleasure as deeply embodied capacities and capabilities. And whether kind of then this pleasure can be also looked at as kind of a connection between these binaries. Sorry if I rambled on, but I was just trying to frame Shomrat's question to just the fabulous work that you presented, and this this deep thick description that you did through this deep history of social thought. So yes.
No, I mean, sure, certainly, why not, right? I mean, at some level, but I think, yeah, I mean, I think there are two different kinds of questions here. One was, or maybe there's three, right? I mean, so one, it seems to me, is actually, what is the language, because of the way that the question was posed in terms of also certain forms and practices of narration, let's just say that. But, what would be the sort of language through which to think through some of this, and indeed, I think that, and if you are thinking about sort of things like the capacity of the body and so on, this moment of a kind of newness, and I've got a piece called "Word and the World," which really thinks about the ways in which what I call sort of capitalist modes of social abstraction and so on, but the presence of the kind of newness that a thinking about colonial capital makes possible also leads to a really profound transformation of language. So you see this with someone like Fule, where the kinds of adjacencies between an earlier set of descriptions, let us say, about sort of caste life and newer representations, if you will, of kind of vagrancy or precarity or indebtedness and so, right, that actually is the opening up of a certain kind of a world. And that world of description, yes, it can be about dispossession, it can be about hardship, but there is surely there is a certain kind of plethora, the presence of the new language itself is transformative, and one would like to think through maybe the question of pleasure. It's a broad kind of category, but there is certainly a kind of enjoyment, right, that gets produced through those new kinds of adjacencies, through the novel forms of experience. And experience is always related to the availability of a new language for understanding that. No, I mean, when you go in and you see you see lights in the city and so on, like Adbi More does, but that it's the sensorium, right? So you can think in a kind of Benjaminian sense that the sensorium has been transformed. So even if you continue to be the kind of, the laboring Dalit, okay, now you've moved from the village to the city, and of course this is the case. But there is something about being inserted into the relations of relations. I mean, this is the other thing I should have said, that, Ambedkar is also doing with caste in India, that, he's thinking about caste as a set of relations in the way that, language theorists, the early folks writing about structuralism and so forth will call it. So I think there is something there about those modes of experience and narration and new forms of language and so forth that might, produce something like this order of pleasure that you're talking about. The other, I think, is just, and in some ways going back to your Lord Riord question, I think the question of the body's capacity in some sense for, and that's why I said, there's a kind of porosity, is this violence, is this pleasure, right? Is this desire or is this violence? And that becomes the great, both, unthinkable, but also in a sense, the kind of unsayable, right? And I think, Lord and others are kind of really struggling with that the body does have the capacity in some sense for a kind of joyous being. But then you have to think at the level of flesh, right? So Lord and Horton Spillers and so on are thinking at the level of flesh. But again, let me sort of caution, having, talked about sort of Ambedkar and caste and why it's not race and so on. These things they open up certain ways of thinking, but it's not clear to me that in the kind of social orders in which caste beings, they're located, that they inhabit, it's a difficult kind of a conversation to have, and we actually don't have the kind of analytic thickness, right, to actually engage in those forms of kind of description, analysis, and so on. I think some of that is beginning to happen, with kind of a queer Dalit critique. Really ways in which, there the question of, orders of sexuality and then orders of caste, you're kind of, they're not commensurable. Right? That's why I keep saying, this is not about intersectionality. It's about a kind of incommensurability that actually opens up a space for different modes of experience, engagement, analysis. And I think that's probably the space that really is beginning to be opened up in terms of new kinds of Dalit formations that are coming to the fore. That's why, I say this, and I say this as a form of self-critique too, I guess, in some sense. But, one has to put this in place before one can start thinking about other spaces. But, there has been, for thinking about Dalit life, there has been a kind of saturation of the political question, right? How do we come into the question of right? How do we come into right? Not the question of how do we come into rights? How do we think equality? How do we think material resources? How do we think reservations? The question of those. There's very real stuff at stake because it's a question of survival. And it is a question of dignity. And it is a question of self-regard. And it is a question of respect and recognition. So that, has tended to be the framework in which one has operated. And I think that kind of a kind of political history as well, given our own histories of kind of, colonialism, anti-colonial thought, post-colonial critique, and so on, that has been the domain where one has tended to work. And I think some of these kinds of these questions, and concerns that are emerging from literary worlds, literary spaces, maybe also spaces of kind of spirituality, so-called, religious spaces and so on. These, I think the words have not been thought through enough on their own terms, in terms of the work they're doing, perhaps. And maybe that is the question that, both of you are really opening up. It is the, what is to come, in some sense, right? And moving away from some received modes of narrating and explaining.
But I this was not so much kind of a critique to to your work as saying
opening up. Where do we go? Absolutely.
We need to look at that deep history just to see how these formations were, the way they were sustained, politically, socially, intellectually, kind of as kind of global formations.
Yes. No, absolutely. And in somewhere there, Ritu had sort of, begun by thinking through the kind of imaginative links that, in some sense, Ambedkar has to create, right? He has to imagine, and it's not a utopia, it's a dystopia very often that he has to imagine. There's nothing utopian about it, but he has to kind of, engage in an act of imagination. He has to engage in an act of, kind of filling in the ellipsis and so on and so forth. And it's not clear that, he's not himself much more open to that kind of, thinking of the deep history in a way that, may not be so comfortable for anti-caste theorists or activists today, that, he actually does want to engage on that field. He wants to think about ontology. He's, and this is something else too, that brings me back, I'd spoken about the Goffman and the psychic life of race. And this again is the place where I think, the race thinkers, the race thinking really is engaging. And maybe because this is, race is a modern formation, caste is an ancient form, and so on and so forth. But because it is seen to be that, and that race can't be explained in some sense, it's the big, embarrassment for modern social, thought and social formations and so on. But, so much of that work that we have is about the psychic life of race and racism. Right, the humiliation, somebody passing you by, you being called last even though you went in first into a restaurant, so all of those slights and the prejudices and the very minor ways in which we begin to notice that social world, we don't quite have that same kind of, elaborated, every day for also thinking about caste. We also don't have that elaborated every day, I think, and I'll go with, something that I think maybe Suraj Yende has been talking about a lot, right? The idea of sort of, Brahmins, creating their own ethnographies and Brahmins being their own, what does he call them, cultural suicide bombers and so on, right? But that, the gaze actually has not been on the dominant as well. So is the dominant, capable of kind of outing itself and saying, yes, I may be anti-caste, but in my practice, this is the ways in which caste produce, or, I haven't had an inter-caste marriage, so there are very, very different ways in which, one would still continue to think about, one's investment or one's unwitting reproduction, you might say, of orders of caste dominance and domination and so on. So I think we don't have that nitty-gritty, speaking of that psychic life of caste. And that's also probably where we're beginning to get, and that's the relation between, kind of literature and life, as it were. And if that life doesn't get kind of elaborated, Perumal Murugan, for instance, he doesn't just write about Dalit communities, he's also writing about other lower caste communities. And the very interesting, speaking about somebody like Ambedkar, who's writing about everybody's complicity in the structure of caste. He's talking about, lower caste and their relationship to each other. And it's this enormously rich world, right? The minutiae of detail and so on. And, nobody gets to get off the hook, including perhaps, the radical Dalits, right? So those are, I think, kind of difficult conversations, and they're very difficult conversations to have in a social order where, I do think that the material question, the question of social exclusion is so profoundly front and center, especially right now, in terms of what's going on. So I think those who want to move to those spaces are also seen to sort of not be doing the really important work, or they're not doing what's, the important work of caste annihilation or remediation and so on. So it's worth thinking about that. There is an impress of the present upon us and how we feel we need to speak to it too. But yeah, I agree with, I think, both you and Samrat about this space and, how we might think of opening it up, for sure, yeah.
So, Anirban, we had a few more questions from YouTube. Will you please read that out? Maybe one or two, not all, and then we can. Are you there, Anirban? So I think I'll just read out a question. Will I?
Yes, Ritu, why don't you?
Yeah, let me see. This is from, the question is, people who speak about symbolic and systemic exploitation of caste have to relive the trauma. How does it come across to the listeners? Narratives of pain alone? This is from Varuna Murmu, who is an associate professor, Department of History, Jadavpur University.
I'm not quite following, I think, the question.
Yeah.
That is that one runs the risk of kind of reproducing. It's like a second order trauma in going through these acts of narration.
Yeah, I think it's about that, because people who speak about symbolic and systematic exploitation, yes. And how about the listeners, whether the kind of experiences that they go through while they are reading it? Yeah, that maybe that's the point she's making.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know from which side one wants to think through this question. As I said, I mean, if it's the issue that one is kind of reliving a kind of trauma, partly also because one doesn't have the space. I mean, it's not about speaking, but it's also about listening, right? So that you don't have the capacity to be in a world where people are able to hear you in the way in which you wish to be heard, yet it is a very, very great risk. And that's why that one also has to think through one's contemporary moment. One has to think through, in a sense, the politics of the present. And if I understand this correctly as well, this is that, there are voices that are amplified and or ways in which certain kinds of experiences can be kind of snipped from their broader contexts and made amenable, almost as a kind of meme, right? They're repeated again and again and again. And either they become ubiquitous and banal, or they become kind of defining, i.e. stigmatizing, and continue to do so, which is why I think, there is a great danger, and that's why this conversation about sort of the literary and so forth as well, I qualified a little bit by saying that it requires certain modes of reading that perhaps a kind of large public that has grown up on expecting, I might almost say, going back to what I said about genre, expecting to hear particular kinds of narratives about suffering and overcoming them, and the kind of Bildungsroman moment, i.e., my goodness, this was the moment when I realized that something had to change. So that kind of a narrative, it's very possible that one is, that those are the narrative expectations that are set up. So I'm afraid I can't answer that question except to say that I think it's a very great risk, and it's a social risk, and it's hazardous, right? It's the hazard of actually, becoming a certain kind of public speaking subject, which means that one is being subjected, and one is, subjecting oneself, and one is being made subject in particular ways. So yes, it's a great risk. It's a great risk, especially because we may not have others who can actually form the phalanx of solidarity and affinity and allyship in order to adequately protect. And I think I am thinking about social media here, and the enormous hazard and the predicament, in a sense, of the progressive subject who comes into the world of social media today, clearly, as well.
Anirban, we can hear you now.
Oh, you can hear me now?
Yes, Anirban, yes.
Oh. The technical thing was like absolute. Now you can hear me, no? But the camera is like I cannot on.
Yeah, we can hear you now, Anirban. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Yeah. Fine. Thank you. So like I missed this last portion. Well, I think we are just coming to the end. I was just thinking how to put in like two points. One is like about this very interesting question of pleasure that has been raised. Uh, like one thing I was like there are 2 points that I like wanted to make. One is that something which is like very old, something we always have to remember. I think when one thinks about questions of pleasure, is the question of gendered ideology that works in the notion of pleasure, the question of reproductive heteronormativity, working through notions of pleasure, even when like pleasure seems to be something which is again like before and beyond a sort of like ideologies of rational thinking, something like that. And another is the way one can think of pleasure through questions of like touch and untouched, as like Aniket Jaware has been talking of in his book. Hello? Yeah. And I understand, yeah. But these are only 2 points that one has to keep in mind. One is something one has to like not let go, and another is some ways of thinking about pleasure which might be a little different. Like Jaware's work, I was like really thinking of when the question of touch in terms not only of like touch something as a sort of in terms of an immediate presence, but touch in terms of like the significations with which it is associated with, and which practically I think the way pleasure is now being talked about by Shomrat or Sirupa, that might be productive thinking in these terms. That is just a small point that I thought we may think of. Hello?
Yes, sure. I mean, I think Aniket's book is in many ways, it seems to me, a different kind of an act of de-abstraction, if you will, and rebuilding the system, and of course it's a text that's deeply suspicious of sociological thinking. In fact, it has precisely the kind of argument about the inability of sociological thinking to actually get to this level. I mean, we've been talking about the everyday and so on and so on, but to really get to the level, the kind of basic, the minimal level at which where you could think of this as the level of kind of precept and so on and so forth, where the question of touch really allows you to begin to build a kind of a system and so on. So I think the kind of simple response would be to say yes, that seems to be one way to kind of engage in a deepening of some of the conversations we've been having, but it's also opening up the idea that terms such as pleasure and so forth are also very, very freighted. They come with their own histories. Speaking of concepts or even sort of words that have certain kinds of histories. I don't know if I want to give pleasure the status maybe as of kind of concept, but be that as it may, that these are terribly freighted terms, and that it might be worth our while to work with other kinds of words. It's an argument also about kind of everyday philosophy, I suppose one could say. And that perhaps there are other kinds of terms. So touch certainly would be one, that there is, there is pleasurable touch, there is good touch, and there is bad touch. And this is one way to think about sort of domains of pleasure, or to think about the porosity, as it were, of pain and pleasure, but also the kind of fugitive nature of perhaps what we're calling, pleasure. And there's very different orders of experiencing this. Yes, this can be at the level of sort of the body. This can be at the level of, actually reading a good piece of work, theoretical, literary, whatever it may be. So yes, I think, if more broadly yet, since we're getting to the end of our time together, if more broadly yet we're thinking about the ways in which certain kinds of terms historically, again, coming back to the term society, sociality, sociability, sociology itself, given this seminar, if we think about the ways in which these are terms that have acquired a really thick history, and perhaps a history that's not allowing us to see certain things, to explore certain kinds of problems, to open up certain kinds of thought spaces, then I think the kinds of projects of a kind of de-abstraction, if you will, of moving, again, I hesitate to sort of use terms like ontological, that somehow this is a better way to think about the question than the epistemological, and so forth. So if we wanted to think about the social, there is something that kind of is experienced at the level of being that happens before we enter the domain of thinking or thinking about it. I would find that itself slightly troubling. But if the question is that, we need to kind of engage in a process of de-abstraction more broadly yet, then I think, these 3 days and the kinds of conversations that have been happening, that this is also a project of a particular kind of ethics, which places a certain set of demands on us, then I think I'm very much, in line with that. I'm very supportive of it.
Fine. Thank you so much for these. And I think, are there any more questions, Ritu, like in the YouTube or something? Probably not, no? Yeah. So like I like heartily thank Professor Anupama Rao for the excellent talk and the whole discussion where you have addressed the questions, the comments in very very interesting ways. And so I think we should now close this session, and whether Ritu or Tikri, you would want to say something at the end.
No, actually, I don't have anything else to say. I was just wondering, while pointing at the kind of conversations that we were just having concerning the kind of if I have to say it like that, the principle of pleasure. So I would just want to read out 2 lines from a very renowned feminist poet in Tamil. She is Sukirtha Rani. So she writes that at the top of my hole, planted in my vagina, the flag of our freedom shall fly, painted in the color of blood. So it goes like this. And I think if we do not have any other questions, we can end the session here. We look forward to our future conversations and future discussions with each other. So that's it. And we have
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, and really forgive me for my technological it is like it.
So I think maybe so you have a functional sort of a duty that should be performed. Please unmute yourself.
Hello?
Yes.
So it's for Titir to perform, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Titir, unmute yourself. You should unmute yourself. Titir. I think the connection is getting disrupted. So we are at the fag end of the event, and Titir was supposed to say something, and maybe she's unable to do that. So on behalf of Titir, I must... are you there, Titir? So we should end here, and I will personally... Oh, she has joined. It's up to you, Titir, now. Maybe.
Am I audible?
Yes.
I'm sorry for the technical glitch. It was a network problem. Sorry. I deem it a great honor and privilege to be given the opportunity to thank everyone on this valedictory session of the 3-day international webinar on Theorising Caste, Castes of Theory, organized by the Department of Sociology, West Bengal State University, in collaboration with the IQAC. First and foremost, I would like to thank our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Bashop Chaudhuri, for inaugurating this webinar and his words of encouragement. I thank him for his keen interest, vision, and continuous support in all our efforts. I would also like to thank Professor Orun Hota, Director IQAC, for his advice and unstinting support. My heartfelt thanks goes to Professor Ramanuj Ganguly for his unending support and guidance as the senior-most professor of our department. We are very much grateful to our speakers, Professor Gopal Guru, Professor Sundar Sarukai, and Professor Anupama Rao, who, despite their busy schedule, has found time to give us the opportunity to witness their deliberations. I express my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Anirban and Dr. Chirupa Prasad for steering the event with their sound theoretical knowledge and expertise. I owe my sincere regards and gratitude to Professor Pradeep Bose for his insightful observations that gave a new dimension to this webinar. My sincere reverence goes for Professor Shujata Sen, whose constant support and guidance helps us in all our efforts. I would like to thank the young scholars Hardik Gotobishas, Shamrat Sengupta, Kollan Kumar Das, and Shubhra Saha for their very well-articulated theorizations to make this webinar a success. Though Sayan Chattopadhyay has always been a part of our department, I would like to take this opportunity to thank him for his unending support whenever asked for. I would also like to thank Hardik Gotobishas for his suggestions and methodical planning for making this a successful event. I thank all the distinguished dignitaries, Professor Chandrabha Chakraborty, Professor Kaushik Bandyopadhyay, Professor Shipra Mukherjee, Dr. Sneha Kaur Chaudhuri, and others who were present here for the last 3 days accepting our invitation. I would also like to thank the faculties of the various departments of West Bengal State University for their valuable contribution, guidance, and encouragement in all our efforts. I owe special gratitude to our technical coordinator, Oritra Banerjee, for his commitment, dedication, and untiring support. He has worked day and night without any complaint, right from designing the flyer, modifying and remodifying designs and plans, managing each and every technicality smoothly to make this event a grand success. We are also thankful to Shilajit Biswas for his technical assistance. I owe special gratitude to our participants from different corners of the world for their overwhelming response, unending support, and cooperation. We are very much thankful to have participation from various renowned institutes like Jawaharlal Nehru University, IITs, Vishwabharati, Pune University, CSSC, and many others who raised insightful questions and contributed immensely in making this event a grand success. I owe special thanks and reverence for Professor N. Jairam, Professor Surendra Jondhale, Professor Maitre Chaudhuri, Professor Ashok Kaul, and Professor Pujan Sen for their support and best wishes. I would also like to thank all the students and scholars of the department who has always been a strong pillar of support for the department. Last but not the least, this webinar would not have been possible without the efforts of Professor Ritu Sen Chaudhuri, who conceptualized the entire event and invited eminent scholars and dignitaries in one platform. Now, we come to the end of the 3-day international event and sincerely hope to enjoy such cooperation in our coming endeavors too. Thank you. Thank you all.
Yes, but then before coming to an end, I must say that we all are thankful to Titir Chatterjee, because without her relentless efforts, it wouldn't have been possible. And we are extremely thankful to her.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Ritu. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Welcome. You're most welcome. So, can we just put on our cameras once, and then we can call it a day? Maybe we'll end there.
Not me.
Yes, not you.
Okay.
Others.
Yeah, then they might be having some problems. Okay, so we should end here. And thank you, Shamraj. Your paper was excellent yesterday. I really enjoyed that, and we'll talk about it later. And here is Oritro, the hero of the show. So
Absolute
yes.
hero.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Then you won't let him go like that. He is not the unsung hero. So
So, ma'am,
okay.
I will just end the stream right there. So, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Bye everyone. Really
Bye.
enjoyed
Good night,
it.
everyone. Yeah.
Good night. Good night.